Warning, this episode may contain disturbing content, soothing narration, and mild existential dread. Basically, murder ASMR for stressed professionals. Listener discretion is advised. Hell, it might be necessary.
Investigations into any crime, including arson, usually try to answer 3 questions. Who did it? How did they do it? And why? The who and the how, those are often the easier questions. But that why question, that one can twist your brain into knots. And this case is no exception. In fact, it involves one of the most bizarre motives for arson I've ever come across. Because arsonists usually fall into familiar patterns. There are the financial fires, burning buildings for insurance money. The revenge fires, a business partner, a neighbor, an ex. The fires set to cover up another crime. And then there are the thrill seekers, the firebugs, the people chasing the rush of watching something burn. But then there's this case, a suspected serial arsonist targeting churches, veterans of foreign war posts, and American Legion halls. A pattern so strange investigators eventually gave him a nickname, the God and Country serial arsonist. Police believe he may have set dozens of fires over a period of years, but investigators only ever learned the motive for one of them. And that motive was not what anyone had expected. In fact, it's one of the strangest reasons for arson I've ever heard. This is the story of the God and Country serial arsonist right now on Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark city landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer, former firefighter, and woman that is highly motivated by cheese.
And I'm whimsically contemplating my digital existence.
If you're new here, we welcome you with open arms and the best snacks. But we do need one small favor from you, and it costs absolutely nothing. Head on over to your favorite podcast player and give the show a 5-star rating. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, throw in a written review while you're there. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be poetic. Just say, this podcast is good. Boom, done. On Podbean and Spotify, you can't leave written reviews, but you can leave ratings and episode comments, and that tells the algorithm that we are worthy of attention, so it shows the show to more people. And in a world where we spend our money on research materials like court records to bring you heavily researched cases, we can't exactly afford a PR team, so congratulations. You've just been promoted to the Crime to Burn marketing department. The pay sucks. But if it makes you feel any better, we're not getting paid either. You can also tickle the algorithm for us by following Crime to Burn on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Likes, comments, saves, and shares all help us find our audience. And the best part is, it is totally free. But if you would like to help offset the cost of things like court records, you can join our Patreon, The Cult of Steve, and help us keep bringing you heavily researched episodes. But if that is not in your budget, no worries. Crime to Burn will always be free on your favorite podcast platforms supported by ads. You can find the link to the Patreon in the show notes. You'll also find a link in the show notes to our spread shop where you can grab Crime to Burn merch, because nothing says well-adjusted like a true crime podcast logo on your chest, or in your hands, or on your head. You get the idea. As always, send your case suggestions, episode feedback, or fire stories to crimetoburn@gmail.com. A huge thanks to everyone who takes the time to leave ratings and reviews. We made it to 68 ratings on Apple Podcasts this week. A special thanks to Scott FPE for leaving a written review. Always nice to hear from a fellow fire protection engineer. Over on Spotify, we now have 70 ratings, and a special thanks to Syver Mar Svianson. I really hope I said that right. But thank you for leaving us a comment. We appreciate you taking the time. And finally, this week we were notified that Crime to Burn made FeedSpot's Top 100 True Crime Podcast list for 2026. So, woohoo for us. If we could just get Apple Podcasts to notice us next. And next week we've got a very special episode coming up. Sean Simons and Alvaro Llanos will be joining us. They are the 2 survivors of the Seton Hall fire that we covered over the last 2 weeks, and we are incredibly excited to welcome them as guests. Now, this week we're covering our 3rd case from the book Bang, Boom, Burn by Wayne M. Miller. Now, Wayne is a former ATF arson investigator and a future podcast guest, and he's written 2 books about the investigations that he worked on during his career. One of his books is Bang, Boom, Burn, which this case is taken from, and that book covers multiple cases from his time at the ATF. His other book is called Burn, Boston, Burn, which focuses on a serial arson case that he helped investigate in Boston, as you may have guessed from the title. You can find both of Wayne's books in the show notes. And a quick disclaimer before we go any further. To my knowledge, the suspected arsonist in this case was only ever charged with 1 attempted arson and 1 arson. And we're about to talk about a whole lot more fires that investigators suspected him of setting. Those other fires are all alleged. That said, somebody was extremely busy in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and they were burning churches and torching veterans organizations like the VFW halls and American Legion posts. There were more than 40 fires, which is impressive in the worst possible way. And investigators believed that those fires were connected because they all followed the same basic method of operation. Now, before we get into the individual fires, I need to clear up one annoying little issue with the timeline. In Bang, Boom, Burn, Wayne places the main string of arsons between 1989 and 1993. The problem is we have at least 2 fires in 1988, and other sources make it clear that the suspected arsonist was already under investigation by 1988. Which means the fire pattern had to have started by then, if not earlier. And that's not unusual in arson investigations. Detectives often discover the pattern after the fires have already been burning their way across multiple towns. So, for the sake of keeping the story sane, I'm going to refer to the earliest part of this series simply as happening in the late 1980s, with the understanding that the known pattern reaches back to at least 1988 and possibly earlier. So let's start with the targets. There was a string of fires that hit Protestant churches. Now, Wayne in his book specifically mentions Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, and other Protestant congregations. And he made a point of noting that these were smaller churches and not like the big Catholic churches, which strongly suggests the Catholic churches weren't his targets. Now, why that is, I don't know. Maybe the arsonist was offended they were serving grape juice instead of wine. Maybe the architecture wasn't his vibe. We may never know. But Wayne also points out something else that's interesting. The arsonist wasn't targeting mosques or Jewish temples either. And that's noteworthy because when you look at religious hate crimes, historically, mosques and synagogues are much more common targets in the US. But that pattern wasn't happening here. Instead, the fires fell into 2 main categories: Protestant churches and veterans organizations like the VFW and American Legion. And that is how investigators ended up giving the offender a nickname that sounds like a rejected country album title: the God and Country Arsonist. And then there's the geography. All of these fires occurred in Massachusetts and pretty dang close to each other. They spanned an area of roughly 15 miles by 20 miles, which in Massachusetts terms is basically one Dunkin' drive-thru and a confusing rotary. And this mattered to investigators because location can tell you a lot about an offender. Wayne explains in his book that arsonists like this tend to start fires in areas they're most comfortable with first, usually very close to home, and then they may gradually spread outward, which makes sense. Criminals, much like the rest of us, prefer committing their questionable life choices in places where they know where the roads go. You don't want to get lost on your way home from a felony. So investigators started mapping the fires, and when they did, a pattern started to emerge.
It was plaid.
The fires formed a rough cluster, and investigators suspected the arsonist probably lived somewhere near the center of that cluster, because even serial arsonists apparently have a commute limit. But it was the modus operandi that really convinced investigators that these fires were likely the work of a single serial arsonist. In each fire, the suspect would drive right up to the building, break a window, pour in a very small amount of gasoline, and ignite it with an open flame. Simple, efficient. Almost lazy, if we're being honest. But investigators noticed something else. They never found the object used to break the window. There was no rocks or tools or anything left behind, which meant the arsonist was bringing something with him, using it, and then taking it when he left. Now, if you're looking for a tool that's portable, efficient at smashing glass, and conveniently available at every hardware store in America, well, a hammer is a pretty good candidate. But there was another strange detail that investigators noticed. This arsonist was frugal. He didn't dump gallons of gasoline everywhere. He used very small amounts. And sometimes he didn't even pour it in places where the fire could really spread. In some cases, investigators found gasoline burned off of concrete or steel, materials that don't burn, meaning that once the gasoline burned away, the fire simply went out. Which tells you something important. This probably wasn't about maximum destruction, because if it were, he was doing a terrible job of it. Instead, investigators started to suspect that there was some other motive driving these fires. So the ATF did what investigators often do in cases like this, and they built a criminal profile. Now, criminal profiling is controversial. Profiling is basically the process of describing the personality and behavioral traits of an unknown offender based on how they committed the crime. In theory, the idea is simple. If you study what the offender did, you can figure out who the offender might be. But there's a problem. Profiling assumes that there's a reliable relationship between how someone sets a fire and who they are as a person, at least when it comes to arson investigation.
There's probably like a 7-question quiz you could take to figure that out.
And that's not always a safe assumption, because a lot of research on arson profiling has found that many profiling theories were based less on hard data and more on, let's call it, professional vibes. Several research papers reviewing profiling literature found that many of the articles they looked at were just anecdotal discussion pieces, not actually statistical or scientific studies, which is not ideal. One review basically concluded that the scientific support for arson profiling was thin at best. By 2009, critics were also pointing out another problem. Some profilers were still relying on outdated personality theories, which meant if investigators weren't keeping up with modern behavioral science, the profiles they produced were likely to be wrong. And when researchers actually tested profiling accuracy, professional profilers with psychology backgrounds did the best. Police investigators did not great, but fire investigators, they finished dead last. Statistically speaking, they performed no better than a control group, which is a very polite academic way of saying you might as well have asked a random guy at the gas station. Now, to be fair, the psychology behind profiling is way outside of my area of expertise. But when you start reading some of these profiles, it occasionally feels a little like reading tea leaves. And some studies have even concluded that there's no statistically reliable relationship between how an arsonist sets a fire and why they set it, which kind of undermines the whole premise. And I'm specifically talking about arson here. There is better support for profiling in other types of crimes, but I don't have time to dig into all of that here. Regardless of how I personally feel about profiling in arson cases, the ATF did create a profile for the God and Country arsonist. So let's take a look at what they came up with. They predicted the arsonist was likely a white male between the ages of 18 and 25 who had underperformed in life. They said he probably had little to no extracurricular activities in high school and was unlikely to have attended college. He would likely be working a menial job on the lower end of the pay scale.
Man, they're dunking on this guy.
They also suggested that he would have few close relationships and would struggle to connect with people, especially with women. So basically their profile was, this guy's having a rough time. Now, if you Googled the profile of an arsonist today, you'll find almost this exact same list. And that's not because profilers have discovered some deep psychological truth. It's just because most of the people who get caught for arson happen to fall into these buckets, which means the profile is less insightful psychological deduction and more statistically likely dude. But the profilers did include one prediction that actually felt like it might carry some weight. They said the arsonist would probably have a vehicle in good working order so he could get away from the scene quickly, which is true. Although I feel like any barista could probably have guessed that too. Right after suggesting the arsonist might also have legs.
Lactose intolerance.
I would set fires too if I couldn't have ice cream.
Don't worry, honey, there's ice cream in the freezer.
And this is where I start to get my feathers a little ruffled. Because armed with their profile, the ATF agents and fire investigators met with local police in the jurisdictions where the fires had been occurring and shared this information in this profile. And somehow, from that profile, one man was identified as a potential suspect. Now, he didn't fit the profile perfectly, but apparently he was close enough that the police began surveilling him. And here's the part that makes me a little uncomfortable. The profile they were working from basically said the arsonist was a white male between 18 and 25, underachieving, probably not very involved in school activities, working low-wage job, struggling in relationships, which, I mean, that can describe a lot of guys, especially in their early 20s. And Wayne never actually tells us why this particular guy ended up on investigators' radar. Was there any sort of physical evidence? Was there some sort of witness statement? Did he live near any of the fires? We just don't know. I would like to believe that investigators had something more concrete than, hey, this guy kind of fits the vibe. But the book never tells us. What we do know is that it wasn't him. Because while the police were surveilling their suspect, more fires broke out, and their guy was clearly not the one there setting it. But I don't like the fact that they'll start tailing somebody off a criminal profile. That seems wrong.
It seems illegal.
I don't really know what the full legalities are. But I have to believe that there was some reason that they started tailing this guy besides he seems to generally fit the profile.
Yeah, let's just pretend there was another reason.
Yeah. But truthfully, what finally pointed investigators toward their most likely suspect wasn't all that much better than profiling. One night in 1988, a car got stuck in some sandy soil off the side of a road, and a helpful police officer stopped to help the driver get unstuck. Now, this should have been a pretty routine roadside assist, but the officer said the driver made him uncomfortable, which, again, y'all, can we please stop building criminal cases on vibes? Apparently, the guy seemed nervous and impatient while the officer was helping him, and the officer just happened to ask if he could take a look in the trunk. And for reasons that remain unclear to me, the man said sure and popped it open. And inside the trunk, the officer saw a gas can, which is not illegal, and sitting nearby, a hammer, which is also not illegal. So once the guy was unstuck and on his way, the officer wrote up his report, and he said he specifically noted that the man had been acting nervous and that there was both a gas can and a hammer in the trunk. And the only reason the hammer stood out to him at all was because ATF investigators had previously told the local police they suspected this arsonist might be using a hammer to break the windows before pouring gas inside the building. Which means at this point, investigators had not a suspect and not evidence, but a man who made a cop uncomfortable and who owned a hammer. So the ATF shows up at his house to have a little chat. And I can only imagine how that conversation went. Hello, sir, the ATF is here because we hear you own a hammer. Which sounds so ridiculous that it almost feels like I made that up, but I didn't. Because the man they were there to talk to was James A. Dix. Now, Dix took a very interesting approach to this conversation. He did not refuse to talk. He did not call a lawyer. Instead, he immediately said, "The only reason you're talking to me is because I got stuck in the sand the other night." And honestly, he wasn't wrong. Because that single awkward roadside encounter with a nervous guy, a gas can, and a hammer was pretty much the entire reason investigators were standing on his porch. But investigators told Dix that they were going to be looking into him for all of those fires, which is certainly one way to conduct an investigation. Personally, I would have thought you would want to keep that information a little closer to the vest, but I'm not the ATF.
And this isn't the same James A. Dix that was an American politician and lawyer and served as a U.S. senator.
Definitely not.
Okay.
So investigators tried to follow Dix, hoping to catch him in the act. But there was a problem. You see, Dix had a job. He had a paper route. And apparently, the man drove like a grandmother transporting a wedding cake. Investigators said they couldn't tail him easily because he drove so far below the speed limit that following him became immediately obvious. He refused to go any faster than 45 miles per hour on the interstate. 45 on the interstate. Which honestly had to be frustrating for a lot more people than just federal investigators trying to tail him. And when he was on the back roads, he apparently crawled even slower. So the ATF found themselves in this bizarre position of trying to secretly follow a suspect serial arsonist who was driving so cautiously that surveillance became impossible. And I have to admit, the idea that the ATF couldn't tail a suspect because he drove too slow is deeply funny to me. But also, I get it. I'd definitely be in a F this job mood if I had to drive below 45 on an interstate. But investigators did attempt to follow him for several days, and it didn't work, because apparently Dix knew he was being followed, so while agents were watching him, no fires occurred. Now, before we get into the next two fires, I need to pause for a second and talk about the timeline, because trying to reconstruct the exact sequence of events from Wayne Miller's book is a little tricky, and that's not because the investigation was sloppy. It's because the story in the book is laid out more in terms of what investigators eventually learned rather than the order that things actually happened, and that's very common in this kind of book. So when you try to line up everything chronologically, some pieces can get a little fuzzy. But what we do know at this point is that investigators were dealing with a growing series of suspicious fires. They had collected tire track measurements from at least one scene, although the soil had been too soft to make a proper cast. And at some point along the way, there had also been that roadside encounter with James Dix, the man who got his car stuck in the sand and happened to have a gas can and a hammer sitting in the trunk. So Dix was at least on the investigators' radar at this point. What I can't say with certainty is exactly when some of those things happened relative to each other. I don't know whether investigators had already spoken with Dix before the next two fires we're about to talk about, or whether that conversation happened afterward. I also don't know whether the surveillance attempts Wayne mentions happened before these fires or after. What I do know is the next fire initially looked like just another frustrating dead end. Another building hit, this time an American Legion post in Holbrook, Massachusetts, and the scene showed the same method investigators had been seeing again and again. A broken window on the rear wall, a burn pattern on the wood floor with some extension up the wall, no inherent ignition sources, and a clear odor of gasoline, no witnesses, no forensic evidence that was obvious, and possibly another case destined for the unsolved pile. Except, that's not how it turned out, because about 24 hours later, another fire broke out. And this time, investigators would recover a piece of evidence that would tie both of these fires together. Now, this fire occurred at Hanover Middle School, less than 10 miles from the American Legion fire. And this fire caused a lot more damage. But investigators again saw the same signs. There was clean glass on the floor, which showed that the window had been broken before the fire started. Only this time, laying in the grass outside the building, investigators found something they had never been able to recover before. An old-fashioned, wooden-handled hammer. And there was a small but important detail. The grass surrounding the hammer had very thick frost on it, but the hammer did not, which means it probably hadn't been laying there very long. Investigators took the hammer into evidence, and you might be thinking, oh perfect, they've got the hammer, just swab it for DNA and see if this Dix guy is their man. But I have to remind you that this was 1988. DNA evidence technically existed then, but it was still brand new, extremely limited, and certainly not something investigators were routinely pulling off a wooden hammer handle at a fire scene. But investigators had a different idea. They wanted to see if they could compare any glass fragments that might be embedded into the hammer's handle to the window that had been broken the night before at the American Legion fire. So if that same hammer had been used at both fires, it could still be carrying some glass fragments. And if those fragments matched, that would tell investigators something really important. It would mean that this same person had set both fires. And sure enough, embedded in the wooden handle was a very tiny sliver of glass, and investigators compared that fragment to the glass recovered from the broken window at the American Legion Hall, and the lab results showed the two were consistent. Meaning that tiny shard of glass embedded in the hammer's handle was chemically indistinguishable from the glass at the Legion Hall. For the first time in this investigation of dozens of fires, two fires were now forensically connected. Until now, the only connection had been the MO, so this was big. So investigators took their evidentiary hammer over to James Dix's house to ask a question. Did it belong to him? But when they showed it to Dix's father, he didn't hesitate. He said, oh yeah, that's his. More specifically, it was a hammer that he had given to his son. Now, you might reasonably be wondering how someone could be so sure about that. I mean, a hammer is a hammer, right? They're not exactly rare. But Papa Dix had a very specific reason for recognizing this one. At some point, the head of the hammer had worked itself loose from the handle, so he fixed it the old-fashioned way. He drove a small wood shim into the top of the handle to tighten the head back down. And when investigators looked at the hammer that they had recovered from the middle school fire, there it was, the same little wooden shim, exactly where he had said it would be. Which meant the hammer investigators found at the crime scene almost certainly belonged to the Dix household. But did James Dix actually fit the criminal profile? Well, sort of. The profile suggested that the suspect would likely have a low-end menial job, and Dix did. He delivered newspapers. But the profile also predicted the arsonist would have been between 18 and 25 years old, and James Dix was 44, so that's a bit of a miss. The profile suggested the suspect would probably have little education, but Dix had allegedly graduated from Boston College, which again was not lining up with the profile. Another prediction was that the perpetrator would likely have had few or no extracurricular activities in high school. But according to the yearbook, James Dix did have one listed activity: kitchen helper. And I will tell you that right now, it is taking a monumental amount of self-control for me not to break into a chorus of sloppy Joe, sloppy, sloppy. Sorry.
You okay?
He was a lunch lady helper.
So he would be holding up them lunch lady arms.
So I'm going to resist singing the rest of that song for professionalism, mostly.
Bogies and grinder.
Investigators also learned that Dix had joined the U.S. Navy in 1969, but had been released from further service. And despite attempts to track it down, investigators were unable to uncover documentation explaining exactly why he had been released. There was the question of mental health. Dix's father told investigators at one point that his son didn't suffer from any kind of mental illness, but then he did admit in the same conversation that Dix would occasionally yell at people who weren't there. Now, in his father's defense, I don't believe he had any formal psychological training. So all things considered, profiling wasn't exactly knocking this case out of the park, assuming Dix was our god and country arsonist, that is. But even with the forensic link between the two fires, the hammer identification, and a suspect who may have had mental health issues, investigators still didn't have enough to prosecute the case. They were looking at dozens of fires spread across multiple towns, but only 2 of them had any kind of forensic link. Everything else was just a common MO. And that was not enough to take someone to court, according to prosecutors. Then, a couple of years later, in June of 1990, a burglar alarm went off at a Veterans of Foreign Wars post in Foxborough, Massachusetts. The alarm woke up the elderly man who lived across the street. And when he looked outside, he saw an older maroon-colored car pulling out of the VFW driveway without its headlights on. And as the car drove away, the man noticed something else. Flames were now coming out of one of the windows of the building. So he called 911. Now, investigators, like I said, had already been looking at James Dix. And that night, the Holbrook fire chief happened to be awake and at home when he heard the call go out over in Foxborough about the VFW fire. And he knew that Dix was a suspect in these arsons. And he had a suspicion. He wondered if his buddy Dix might have something to do with this fire. So the chief hauled himself out of bed and drove over to Dix's neighborhood to take a look. And sure enough, Jim's Dodge wasn't in the driveway. Also, that Dodge happened to have the same tire measurements as the tracks that investigators had documented at least one of the earlier fire scenes. Also, it was maroon, which just happened to match the description given by the witness who had called 911 after seeing the car leave the VFW driveway before flames burst out the window. Although, to be fair, tire measurements aren't exactly unique. Dozens of cars could have produced the same tire tracks. But the chief parked his car nearby and waited. And about 45 minutes later, Dix pulled into his driveway. So the next day, investigators went to speak with him, and Dix told them, "Oh no, I've been home all night," lied right to their faces. But when investigators pointed out that they had been watching his house when he returned, he changed his story. He said, well, he'd just been restless and couldn't sleep, so he went out for a drive. But even all of that wasn't enough to get prosecutors to bite. They still said they needed something more. And then on February 3rd, 1993, investigators finally got their break. Sort of. A security guard noticed fresh tire tracks in newly fallen snow near a large single-story commercial building that he was guarding. Curious, he followed the tracks, and that's when he saw a man standing near an older, dark-colored car parked at the back of the building. The man was standing against the rear wall, with his arm extended through a broken window into the building. The unidentified man then hurried back to his car to drive away, but the security guard had managed to get the license plate number. When police arrived a short time later, there was no active fire, but the smell of gasoline was very strong, which suggested the fire had been interrupted before it could be started. And this time, investigators had a name, because that vehicle was registered to Joseph Dix, James Dix's father. Investigator brought James Dix in for a lineup, but not exactly the kind you might be picturing. Instead of having the security guard try to ID him, they set up a lineup that included several police officers and James Dix. And the identification was not done by a person, it was done by a canine. The handler had the dog sniff the hands of each person in the lineup, and the dog reached Dix and sat down, alerting that he had detected the presence of an accelerant. The handler pulled the dog back, reset him, and gave him the command again. The dog worked down the line a second time and once again alerted on Dix. So investigators took swabs from Dix's hands, seized his clothing as evidence, and they brought the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office, hoping to charge Dix with at least the 2 fires that were connected by the hammer plus the attempted arson. But prosecutors still weren't convinced, and they decided the case just wasn't strong enough to tie him to the other fires. So instead, he was charged only with the attempted arson at the commercial building where the security guard had interrupted him. And he was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison. And there's one other detail worth mentioning. The building where Dix was caught, it wasn't a church and it wasn't a veterans organization, which means that that particular fire didn't even fit his target pattern. While in prison, Dix was officially diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And for a while, things were quiet until he was released. And then the fire started again. The ATF tried to get a search warrant, but a judge ruled that there wasn't enough probable cause, so investigators were left watching and waiting. And then, Dix ended up back in prison after a violent altercation with 2 neighborhood boys. The story goes that the boys threw a crabapple through a window. One source says it was the house window, another says it was the car window, but which window doesn't really matter. What matters is what Dix allegedly did next. According to reports, he picked up the crabapple, which was now embedded with shards of glass, and tried to force one of the teens to eat it. Now, the boy managed to escape and reported the incident to police, and Dix's parole was revoked and he was sent back to prison. But he was eventually released again. I wasn't able to determine exactly how long he served after that incident. But what we do know is that October 4th, 2010 marks the last known arson attributed to James Dix. That day, Dix showed up for an appointment with his probation officer and demanded that he be sent back to prison. When the officer explained that it didn't work that way, Dix reportedly became very agitated and frustrated, and he actually asked, "Do I have to start a fire and be standing right there in order to get some attention?" So police were called, and Dix was taken to a hospital for a psychological evaluation. But a few hours later, the doctors released him. So he left the hospital. He went to a gas station and purchased $2.50 worth of gasoline. He returned to the probation office, broke a window, poured the gasoline inside, lit it, and then he stood there and waited. Police arrived and arrested him, and Dix finally got what he'd been asking for. He was sent back to prison. The book Bang Boom Burn doesn't tell us how long he was incarcerated after that, and Wayne Miller does note that at the time the book was written, Dix's whereabouts were unknown, which means that dozens of fires across Massachusetts were never officially solved. And the strange case of the God and Country serial arsonist remains at least partially a mystery. And that's the story of the God and Country serial arsonist right here on Crime to Burn. Kittens and recording studios don't mix very well. I learned so many tricks last night. Not that kind of trick.
Are we?
This is the part of the recording where we wait for all the animals to go to sleep. I like big batteries, and I cannot lie. I just can't deny.
When 90,000 milliamps shakes its... I can spring into action at any minute.
Just don't try to do a superhero landing. We have old knees.
There's lots of uses for mannequins. A giant teddy bear won't get you down the HOV lane.
Nope. I'm just saying I'm good at sitting. Look how good I'm doing right now.
You are.
We've shopped for mannequins. We've removed a cat from a drum and a wall and a plant.
We laughed. We cried.
So let's start with the targets. So there were...
That was nice.
But did James Dix actually fit that criminal...
Did James Dick fit where?
Dix, D-I-X. They set up a lineup that included several police officers with Dix mixed in. Oh, that sounds terrible.
Just a normal day at the station. This episode needs a Dix counter. There's so many Dicks.
His last name was Dix. What do you want me to do?
Maybe we should warn people that there's a lot of Dicks in this episode. I went to get a memory card And the guy at the store said there was a global shortage of memory cards. So I asked AI why there's a global shortage of memory cards. And it said it's because people are using AI too much.
So the next time you hear a criminal profile that predicts the suspect will be between the ages of 22 and 25, socially awkward, and possibly enjoys chaos, just remember, somewhere out there is a 44-year-old newspaper delivery man with a hammer and a gas can quietly ruining the curve. This episode brought to you by Vibes, which investigators call criminal profiles. I don't know. I don't feel funny. I feel like my ass hurts. This episode brought to you by Massachusetts traffic patterns, specifically the rotary, a traffic design concept that operates on the bold engineering principle of everyone figure it out at the same time. In theory, the rotary is meant to keep traffic flowing smoothly. In practice, it's a high-speed negotiation between 12 drivers who all believe they have the right of way. You'll notice there are signs, there are lanes, there are even arrows painted on the road. These are not rules, they are merely suggestions, much like the posted speed limit, or blinkers, or the basic understanding that entering a circle already full of vehicles might require a moment of patience. But this is Massachusetts. Patience was outlawed sometime around 1974. So if you ever find yourself driving through a rotary in the greater Boston area, just remember these 3 guiding principles. Maintain speed, avoid eye contact, and commit to whatever lane choice you made 3 seconds ago, even if it's wrong, especially if it's wrong, because hesitation is how they get you. This episode's brought to you by Massachusetts Traffic Circles, where the only thing spinning faster than the cars is everyone's will to live.
I don't know why they call them blinkers. That's stupid. They don't blink, they wink. I call them turn signals because winker sounds weird.
You want to play with my winker? But I definitely don't want to yell at another driver, use your winker, because...
Is your winker broken?
He's going to think I said wanker. I don't know. I haven't looked at a lot of buttholes, to be completely honest.
Does your butthole open like a camera shutter?
I don't know. Truthfully, never checked. So it's going to be like chicken and waffles, but made with rabbit.
Right.
And this is the rabbit that your dad left here?
Yeah.
Not as a pet. Like, it was from the rabbit hunt, intended for meat. It's kind of funny if you think about it that the cops had a lineup to identify dicks.
You ever seen that movie Porky's?
Nope.
I think they suggested a similar lineup.
Opera Joe. But I heard a fascinating factoid today. If you get a block of C4, it says on it not to eat it, that it's poisonous. Do you know why it says that?
Well, clearly someone tried to eat it.
Who do you think tried to eat it?
Who? What person?
Well, what group of people?
Oh, Marines.
Well, it was in the Vietnam War. They figured out that when they were messed with C4, it was roughly the consistency of bubble gum. So some soldier, or maybe a Marine, I don't know, put it in their mouth and started chewing it and realized it was a lot like chewing gum, the consistency of chewing gum. And so they started chewing it because it gave them like a little rush of euphoria. They could get a little bit high off of it. And then they all started getting sick and because it's poisonous. But yeah, soldiers in Vietnam would chew C4 like chewing gum.
Well, there's not much to do. You know, probably get bored.
Probably. But I had no idea. Apparently, whatever gives it that like moldable consistency is like one of the same base ingredients that they use in bubble gum. So people started chewing it. Don't chew your C4.
Especially if you have blasting caps on your teeth.
So now...
Well, they didn't have Bubblicious over there. What are they going to do?
Yeah, I don't know. Let's get out of here.
Yeah.
Crime to Burn is a production of Crime to Burn, LLC, where we light fires in your brain and not your buildings. All rights reserved. Still spiritually parched after this episode? It's okay, Steve believes in cross-pollination. Here's a trailer for a show we think deserves to infiltrate your ear holes in a good way. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review before you go. Steve is watching.
Hi, everyone. We are the hosts of Like Mother, Like Murder, a true crime momcast.
You heard that right. We are a mom cast, which is our unique twist in the true crime world.
What sets us aside is that our content is mainly mom related, from missing moms to murdered moms,
To moms who committed the crime, survivors, and more.
We are getting started on our 3rd season with over 100 episodes that you guys can go and binge. I am Rachel.
And I'm Heather. We drop new episodes every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts at Like Mother,
Like Murder.